Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to explore the aftermath of World War I and how this massive global conflict affected the American society in the years immediately following the war. As you hopefully remember from world history, the United States played a relatively big role in the peace process, but beyond that, there was transformations at home as well. So let's talk about Woodrow Wilson and the aftermath of World War I. So by the end of this lesson, hopefully you can answer these, you can do these things in some detail. And let's kick it off. So as you hopefully remember, the Paris Peace Conference was an absolute disaster. Uh, in the end, not much was solved in this whole thing. The Treaty of Versailles was a hot mess. The Middle East was partitioned, sort of according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as you hopefully remember there, which didn't necessarily create stable nation states in the Middle East. But Herbert Hoover did provide food relief, and the U.S. Food Administration was able to relieve some of the food shortages in Europe. And so, in general, his stature is going to rise because of that. We see that in the cartoon up in the top right corner. But of course, the biggest role that the United States played in the Paris Peace Conference was Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. His proposal for a sort of proto-UN that would hopefully prevent future global conflicts. As you hopefully remember from world history, the League of Nations, although it was eventually supported by the Versailles Peace Conference, which, as we remember, completely rejected all of Woodrow Wilson's other 14 points, Woodrow Wilson was unable to sell the League of Nations to the American people. And so when he came home, he lobbied strongly for the United States to accept the Treaty of Versailles, not because he thought it was a good treaty, because again, all of his 14 points were not included in the Treaty of Versailles, but he lobbied for it because he thought the League of Nations was that important. But the United States was skeptical of this. Obviously, Washington's pledge against lasting alliances was a part of this. Part of it is American sort of independence and our desire to to go it alone, sort of. And part of it was Republican resistance. Republicans in the Senate specifically fought strongly against the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson campaigned so sort of vigorously that he ended up having a stroke, and his wife, Edith, had to run the country for the rest of his term. This is sometimes referred to as the secret presidency, and Edith Wilson is sometimes referred to as the first female president, but no one really knew it at the time. And I think that the actual first female president should probably get that honor, whenever she is elected. The other thing that completely changed sort of the tenor of the post-war world was the Russian Revolution. As you hopefully remember from world history, Vladimir Lenin overthrew the Russian provisional government, and then, thanks mostly to the generalship of Trotsky and also in general the unpopularity of the Russian Tsar and the Whites, the Reds were able to win the Russian Revolution, and Russia became known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the first communist country in the world. This freaked us out because of our long-standing opposition to communism, and the United States actually did dispatch an army to try to aid one of the Russian White armies. Unfortunately for us, we landed it up in the north in Archangel in the winter, and we were trapped up there when the sea froze, and when the Arctic Ocean froze, and we really accomplished nothing but poking the new Soviet Union in the eye, beginning, our several decades of antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the United States, we faced a pretty brutal post-war. In the United States, we faced a pretty brutal post-war recession, as in general, all of the pent-up demand from World War I had led to massive overproduction, and then we got a readjustment back to normal. And so farmers struggled, workers were laid off, all the women who were working in factories, some of them got laid off, and now you've got all this demand for this supply of labor from returning soldiers with a shortage of demand, which leads to recession. And the fact that during the war we had massively blocked the ability to strike, and so wages had stayed constant, and so this built up a lot of friction and tension. And then after the war, we saw tons of strikes, walkouts, protests, things like that. and this led to a significant amount of fear from average Americans that this was the beginning of some sort of transformation or some sort of communist plot to undermine the United States. Oh, and of course, farmers also just get crushed after this war, as farmers get crushed after basically every war. All of this led to, and so the other factor is African Americans returning from this war really were not interested in going back to their second class status. Each time African Americans take up arms and fight for the country, they do it under a sort of tacit social contract that maybe this means that they'll finally be accepted as full members of society. And so returning to both segregated cities of the North and especially the Jim Crow South, these black soldiers refused to follow the sort of the racist policies that had been enacted. And so this led to massive race riots and significant violence against African Americans in all of these cities. So all of this adds to the sense of post-war unease that stuff is coming apart in the aftermath of World War I. The US government and society responds with something called the First Red Scare. This was kicked off by a combination of the strikes, the race riots, and also a series of anarchist bombings that were worried are being orchestrated by the Soviet Union, which honestly they probably weren't, considering the Civil War was still going on. They were probably just sympathizers. But a Wall Street bombing kills 30 people. The Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, a bomb goes off outside his house. And there's this sense that all of these communists and labor agitators are undermining American society. And so we decide to deal with them. We deport many of these, any of the protesters who were foreigners are speedily deported, as it said, right? So we're going to deport huge numbers of both recent immigrants, but also communists in general. We fill up a boat with 300 suspected communists and send it off to St. Petersburg as a quote unquote gift to the Russians. And in general, there's this sense that like we need to crack down on this type of unrest, lest all of this European anarchy destroy the United States. One way that we push back against this is the National Origins Act, in that we pass immigration restrictions in order to prevent specifically Eastern Europeans, who we saw as more connected to this communism, from coming into the United States. And so we basically take a census of the current population of the United States, their current ethnic makeup, and we place a quota in place that says 3% of the current population, the current ethnic group, can come here. So hypothetically, if there were 100 Norwegians in the United States in 1920, then 3 Norwegians could come in every year, with the goal being to keep the sort of racial mix of the United States identical. The only exception to this were Asians, who were banned outright because of opinions like our friend Hazel here over on the right. Most of the deportation policies and in general the massive jailing that were involved as part of the Red Scare were sort of run or orchestrated by A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General. He's going to round up any suspected communist radicals and labor leaders and throw them in jail in order to, as we see here, protect good, God-fearing, non-communist Americans from the bomb-throwing communist hordes that have infiltrated our society. Now, whether or not those people were actually communists is not really here or there. In the end, they were jailed and prosecuted. We also create, in the aftermath of this, the Federal Bureau of Investigations. This is a branch of the Justice Department that is our domestic spy service. And it was originally controlled by J. Edgar Hoover, who we see pictured here much later on the left. All of this leads to some miscarriages of justice, the most famous of which were Sacco and Vanzetti. They were 2 Italian immigrants and possible radicals who were accused and convicted of murder. They were then put to death, and afterwards it turned out that they were not at all associated with the murder, and they were simply caught up in this whole Red Scare thing. As far as civil rights goes, some gains are made and some gains are not. Alice Paul is able to organize suffragettes to put increasing pressure on the president. They picket outside the White House and are arrested in huge numbers. These suffragettes then go on hunger strikes in jail in order to continue to put pressure on President Wilson. And finally, after years of agitation, Wilson throws his support between the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. So, way to jump on the train at the very last minute. Woodrow Wilson, who was, again, I think, as we talked about, a member of the a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan and a white supremacist, does nothing for the benefit, or gives no such benefit to African Americans. Here we see W.E.B. Du Bois basically criticizing the United States for recruiting huge numbers of African Americans to go fight for freedom and liberty, and then doing absolutely nothing to provide them with that freedom and liberty at home. And so the hypocrisy of criticizing the Germans for racist authoritarianism and inequality, and then, basically doing the same thing to a whole group of American citizens, was not lost on most of these advocates. But African Americans are going to have to wait at least another generation before wide sweeping changes happen. This brings us back to our objectives. Hopefully you can answer these in some detail. And when we come back, we'll start to look at the way American culture begins to shift as we move into the 1920s.